Welcome back to Whispers of Time. I'm your guide on tonight's journey into one of humanity's most extraordinary chapters, a story not of triumph, but of quiet resilience, of survival against odds that would silence most living things. Tonight, we're traveling back 20,000 years to a moment when the world was unimaginably different from the one you know, a moment when the very ground beneath human feet was frozen solid, when the night lasted longer than the day in many places, and when our ancestors faced a choice that would echo through the rest of human history: stay, adapt, and survive, or flee to warmer lands and risk being forgotten. You might think that the story of human survival during the Ice Age is one of desperation, of people huddling in caves, barely eking out existence. But I want to challenge that image tonight, because what we've come to understand through archaeology, through the careful study of ancient bones and hearths and tools, is something far more profound. Our ancestors didn't just survive the Ice Age, they thrived. They built communities, they created art, they developed technologies we can barely comprehend. They loved, they laughed, they buried their dead with respect. They left handprints on cave walls that still move us to tears today. They were, in every meaningful way, just like us, living in the harshest conditions the earth could offer, yet finding ways not just to endure, but to create meaning. Think about that for a moment. Imagine stepping outside on the coldest day you can remember, that bone-chilling winter morning, where the air itself seems to hurt your lungs. Now, imagine that is summer where you live. Imagine that the brief warm months are your window to gather enough food for a winter that will last not 3 months, but nearly 9. Imagine that you have no grocery stores, no electricity, no heated homes waiting for you. Imagine that survival depends entirely on your knowledge, your creativity, your ability to work with others, and your willingness to use your mind in ways we rarely need to use ours today. This is the world of our ancestors, 20,000 years ago, during what scientists call the Last Glacial Maximum, the coldest point of the most recent ice age. And this is their story. It is a story of human ingenuity. It is a story of love and family bonds. It is a story of art made in darkness, of tools crafted with precision, of communities bound together by more than just the need to survive. It is a story that should humble us and inspire us in equal measure. Here's what I want you to know as we begin. These people were not primitive. That word, primitive, it's perhaps the greatest lie we tell ourselves about prehistory. They had brains identical to ours. They had language, complex language. They had religion, spirituality, art. They had jokes, apparently. They had dreams. And they faced a world so cold, so challenging, so utterly unforgiving, that by any rational measure, they should not have survived at all. But they did. And how they did it. The methods they developed, the technologies they invented, the social bonds they strengthened, this is what we're here to explore together tonight. Because in understanding how they survived their longest, coldest nights, perhaps we learn something about how to navigate our own. Let me paint a picture for you of what the Earth looked like 20,000 years ago. When the last glacial maximum reached its peak, occurring sometime between approximately 26,000 and 20,000 years ago, with most intense conditions around 21,000 years ago, the planet was dramatically different from the world you inhabit today. Imagine standing on the edge of a vast ice sheet so enormous that it would take you weeks to walk from one edge to the other. The ice here rises like mountains, thousands of feet high. Above, the sky is often gray and featureless. The sun, when it appears at all, is a pale, weak thing. It provides light but precious little warmth. According to recent research from universities including Arizona and Michigan, the global average temperature during the last glacial maximum was approximately 6 degrees Celsius, about 11 degrees Fahrenheit, colder than today. In Europe specifically, particularly at higher latitudes, and especially during winter months, regional temperatures were considerably more severe, potentially 15 to 20 degrees Celsius colder than present conditions. This represents what we might call polar amplification. The higher latitudes experience greater cooling than the global average. But these are averages. On many nights, it was far colder, and the cold was a different kind of cold than we experience today. A dry, penetrating cold that seemed to drain warmth from the body with relentless efficiency. The landscape itself was transformed. Where there is now temperate forest and grassland across much of Europe, there was then a vast steppe, an open, windswept plain of low vegetation, hardy grasses, shrubs, lichens. Scattered stands of birch and pine struggled to survive where they could find purchase. There were no tall trees in most places, no dense forests. The reason was simple. The climate was too cold and too dry. Moisture that might have fallen as rain fell instead as snow, much of it blown into drifts by the relentless wind. And yet, and this is crucial to understand, this landscape was not empty. It was not a dead zone. Recent research has suggested that human populations remain spread across Europe, even during the harshest conditions of the Ice Age. This tells us something remarkable. While many animal species retreated to warmer refugia in southern Europe and the Mediterranean, humans did not retreat entirely. Instead, they adapted, they stayed. They learned to live in this harsh world. What made this possible? Begin with the animals. The landscape of the Last Glacial Maximum supported large herds of megafauna, the giants of that era. Woolly mammoths roamed the steppes, their massive bodies insulated by thick coats of fur and layers of fat. These creatures could weigh up to 9 tons. Imagine encountering one. The sheer presence of it, the size, the power. Woolly rhinoceroses were equally impressive, armored creatures with horns and thick hides. There were wild horses, smaller and faster than their modern descendants, but still substantial creatures. Reindeer moved in vast herds. Bison and aurochs, the ancient ancestors of modern cattle, grazed the grasslands. Cave lions and cave bears hunted the same prey. There were saber-toothed cats, fearsome predators that made this landscape genuinely dangerous. There were also woolly rhinos, massive creatures that, while well adapted to cold, still represented competition for resources. For our human ancestors, these animals represented survival itself. They represented food, yes, but also so much more. Hides for clothing and shelter coverings, bones for tools and structures, fat for fuel. A single mammoth represented enough meat to feed a human community for weeks or even months, if preserved properly. The challenge was obtaining that meat, but we'll come to that remarkable story later. The climate was also characterized by something else: extreme seasonality. The seasons weren't gentle transitions, they were violent shifts. Summer, when it came, could be surprisingly warm, in some places reaching temperatures comparable to what we might experience in a mild spring day today. But summer was brief, desperately brief. It lasted perhaps 3 months, sometimes less. During these 3 months, plants grew rapidly. The steppe would bloom with wildflowers. Insects would emerge in clouds. Birds would migrate north. Salmon would run in rivers. It was a time of abundance, but also a time of frantic preparation. Because those 3 months of summer were the only time to gather enough food, craft enough tools, prepare enough material to survive the coming winter. Winter, when it came hard and stayed long. It lasted 7, 8, sometimes 9 months. The sun, which had been relatively high in the sky during summer, now barely climbed above the horizon. In more northern latitudes, winter meant extended darkness. Periods where the sun set in the early afternoon and didn't rise until late morning. The temperatures plummeted. Winds howled across the steppe with nothing to stop them. Snow fell, and the cold was so intense that the moisture in the air seemed to freeze before it could properly snow. Instead, there was this peculiar phenomenon where the air became filled with ice crystals, creating a shimmering, almost beautiful effect, but also making travel treacherous and survival uncertain. Dust levels in the atmosphere were significantly elevated. Research shows dust levels during the Last Glacial Maximum were as much as 20 to 25 times greater than present-day levels. This is the world our ancestors faced. This is the longest, coldest night of our title. Not a single night, but a season that lasted nearly 3/4 of the year. A season where food was scarce, where warmth had to be generated from within the body and from carefully maintained fires, where the psychological strain of persistent cold and darkness would have been as challenging as the physical threat. And yet, here's where the story shifts. Here's where our ancestors' resilience becomes visible. Archaeological evidence shows that humans had developed clothing, built dwellings, and controlled fire during the cold conditions of the last ice age, not as occasional adaptations, but as systematic, sophisticated technologies that they had perfected over generations. They hadn't merely survived in this landscape, they had figured out how to thrive. When we talk about technology, we often think of modern inventions, smartphones, computers, cars. But technology at its heart is simply this: taking what nature gives you and figuring out how to use it to solve problems. Our Ice Age ancestors were technologists of the highest order. Consider the needle. This small object, no larger than your fingernail, represents a revolution. Around 30,000 years ago, humans developed needles carved from ivory or bone with tiny eyes bored through with a fine-pointed flint drill. The miracle of the needle was that it enabled humans to make tight-fitting clothing tailored to the individual. Before the needle, people wore loose-fitting animal hides draped over their bodies. This provided some insulation, but not enough for extreme cold. With the needle came the ability to sew hides together tightly to create fitted clothing, and this clothing was layered. Imagine the Ice Age tailor at work. They understood something that modern mountaineers only rediscovered in the 20th century. You don't keep warm with a single thick garment. You keep warm with layers. An Ice Age person might wear inner layers of soft, hair-inward hide to trap warm air against the skin. Middle layers of fur from reindeer or Arctic foxes provided insulation and wind resistance. Outer layers of carefully selected hides offered waterproofing, because in that frozen environment, moisture was dangerous. Wet clothing meant death, because the temperature was so cold that water would freeze rather than evaporate. But these outer layers had to be waterproof, and Ice Age artisans seem to have understood how to select and treat hides to achieve this. Thread? It wasn't always available from animal sinews. Researchers have found evidence that Ice Age artisans used plant fibers, wild flax, and other vegetation, twisted and processed into thread, and this thread was sometimes dyed. Archaeological evidence suggests hues of turquoise and pink. These weren't accidental colors, they were intentional, suggesting that even in this harsh environment, our ancestors cared about aesthetics, about beauty. They wore clothing that protected them, yes, but they also wore clothing that was beautiful to them. But clothing was only the beginning. Consider shelter. In the coldest months, people didn't actually live deep inside caves, contrary to what Victorian archaeologists once imagined. Instead, evidence shows that Ice Age humans made extensive modifications to weatherproof their rock shelters. They draped large hides from the overhangs to protect themselves from piercing winds, and built internal tent-like structures made of wooden poles covered with sewn hides, all situated around a blazing hearth that reflected heat and light off the rock walls. The engineering here is sophisticated. A rock shelter provides some protection from the elements, but it's not a room with walls on all sides. The front is open. So Ice Age architects did something clever. They created a shelter within a shelter. Inside the rock overhang, they built a structure from wooden poles, creating the framework of what looks rather like a modern tent or yurt. They then covered this framework with hides, likely sewn together and sealed at the seams. At the center, they maintained a fire. The heat from that fire would warm the enclosed space, and the smoke would rise and escape through the top, helping to preserve the structure and perhaps even preventing insects. The rock wall behind would reflect heat back into the shelter, multiplying the warmth. These structures, sometimes called tent-like huts or hearth-centered shelters, were not permanent. They were designed to be used seasonally, perhaps abandoned during the summer when people moved out onto the open plains to follow migrating herds, then reoccupied when cold returned. Multiple such structures have been found at single sites, suggesting that regular camps or gathering places existed, places where communities returned year after year, generation after generation. But beyond the rock shelters, when people moved out onto the open plains in summer and early autumn, they built something even more remarkable, dwellings made entirely from natural materials at hand. The framework was built from a latticework of mammoth bones, either hunted or raided from carcasses. On top, they laid sod or animal hides to make a house that was occupied for months on end. These bone frame structures were, in effect, the great tents of the Ice Age plains. The bones provided a rigid framework. The hides created an envelope of warmth. The design was efficient, portable. Once the people moved, the bones could be abandoned or reused, and suited to the landscape. Now, how did people acquire these mammoth bones? The bones could come from animals they hunted, yes, but there's another source. Already dead mammoths. These creatures lived long lives, and when they died, their carcasses would remain on the landscape, preserved by the cold. An Ice Age community, spotting the skeletal remains of a mammoth, could harvest the bones and use them. Archaeological sites have revealed what we might call bone piles, accumulated remains suggesting that people were regularly collecting mammoth bones for building materials. And then there's fire. Fire, controlled and maintained, was as essential as any other technology. It provided heat, obviously, but it also cooked food, making otherwise indigestible plant material, edible and raw meat safer, dried meat for preservation, hardened wooden tools, and provided light in the darkness. Ice Age people didn't just make fires when they needed them. Evidence suggests they maintained fires continuously, carefully, as precious resources. Some archaeological sites show evidence of ash layers suggesting fires that burned for years, tended by successive generations. Beyond these major technologies, there were countless smaller ones. The burin, a rock chisel, was used to cut grooves and notches into bone and antler, lightweight materials that were also hard and durable. The intricate spearheads and harpoon tips made from bone and antler were small and light enough to be carried on foot by hunters over long distances, and were also detachable and interchangeable, creating the first compound tools. These microliths, tiny sharp stone tools, were hafted, attached to bone or wooden shafts to create specialized implements. An atlatl, a spear thrower, increased the force and distance of a thrown spear. Hooks made from bone allowed for fishing. The sophistication here is remarkable. These weren't crude implements. They show careful thought about design, about materials, about the specific function each tool needed to serve. A scraper for removing flesh from hides, a blade for cutting meat, a point for hunting, a barb for fishing. Each tool was designed for a specific task, refined through generations of use and experimentation. This was not trial and error on a large scale. This was accumulated knowledge, passed down, refined, improved. What this all adds up to is this. Ice Age people were not victims of their environment. They were engineers, innovators, designers. They looked at the world around them, the bones of mammoths, the hides of animals, the wood of rare trees, the stone available in their landscape, and they figured out how to transform these raw materials into technologies that allowed survival in an otherwise impossible place. When most people imagine Ice Age hunting, they picture something straightforward. A hunter, spear in hand, facing down a woolly mammoth. The hunter throws the spear, it hits. The mammoth falls, meat is secured. This image is likely wrong, based on recent archaeological evidence. And what actually happened was, in many ways, far more impressive. A mammal that weighs 9 tons, that's roughly the weight of 3 elephants, is not a creature that dies easily. A spear thrown by a human hand, even a strong human hand, has limited penetrating power. It might wound an animal, create pain, but killing it? That's a different matter entirely. Yet we have archaeological evidence that mammoths were being killed and butchered. Recent research from UC Berkeley archaeologists proposes that humans may have used a fundamentally different technique. They may have planted spears in the ground, with their sharp tips pointing upward, to impale approaching animals. This technique, known as pike hunting, would generate tremendous force, the animal's own weight and momentum doing the work, rather than human arm strength. This approach would potentially generate far more force, enough to pierce the thick hides of megafauna, than humans throwing or thrusting spears could accomplish. Let me paint this image for you, based on what archaeological evidence suggests. Imagine a group of hunters, perhaps 15 or 20 of them. They have scouted a route that mammoths regularly travel, a narrow valley perhaps, or a pass between ridges. They understand something crucial. Mammoths, for all their massive size and strength, are herd animals. They follow established routes. They have patterns. The hunters place a series of sharpened spears vertically, with the sharp points angled slightly upward. They might cover these with vegetation, with snow, making them less visible. Then the hunters drive a herd of mammoths toward this location, using fire and noise to keep them moving forward. As the terrified animals charge through the valley or pass, they encounter these planted spears. The force of a charging mammoth running into an angled spear at speed, that could generate tremendous force, far more than a human arm could possibly deliver. The spear penetrates the animal's body. The mammoth is wounded, bleeding. If multiple spears strike, if the wounds are deep enough, the animal might fall, or it might collapse later, weakened by blood loss. This hunting technique requires several things. First, it requires knowledge of where mammoths travel, of their behavior, of the landscape. Second, it requires coordination. Many hunters working together to drive herds, to position themselves strategically. Third, it requires planning, gathering materials to create spears, preparing a location, working together in sequence. This is not a hunt born of chance or impulse. This is a hunt that's been planned, discussed, perhaps rehearsed. But there's another form of hunting that evidence more clearly confirms: strategic culling of herds at natural choke points. In eastern France, at a site marked by a limestone tower known as the Roche de Solutré, Ice Age hunters appear to have developed a sophisticated seasonal hunting strategy. Archaeological evidence indicates that hunters exploited this natural geographic feature to harvest migrating herds. Based on the concentration of horse and reindeer bones found at the site, potentially numbering in the thousands over thousands of years, it appears that groups of hunters may have used strategic methods to intercept and kill animals. The precise method remains somewhat debated, but evidence suggests hunters likely drove animals toward the natural barrier of the rock formation itself, where they could be killed at close quarters. This well-coordinated harvesting appears to have gone on for tens of thousands of years, suggesting that successful hunting locations were repeatedly visited, generation after generation. This archaeological discovery is extraordinary for several reasons. It shows that hunters return to the same location, season after season, for tens of thousands of years. They understood that herds migrated at certain times and used certain routes. They built a system, the valley and natural barriers, that allowed them to harvest animals systematically. And the success of this system was apparently so effective that they kept using it generation after generation, their descendants following the practices their ancestors had established. Imagine being part of this community. You're born into a world where you're taught from childhood that every year, at certain times, when the herds begin to move, you and your people go to this location. You spend weeks preparing, gathering materials, preparing tools, readying your hunting equipment. Then, as the herds begin to move, you participate in the hunt. You help direct the animals. You help dispatch them. And then, this is crucial, you help preserve the meat. Because that's the real mastery here. Not just hunting, but hunting in a way that generates a surplus. A single well-executed hunt could provide more meat than a small group could immediately consume. The skill was in harvesting that meat, and then preserving it for the months to come. Archaeological evidence from multiple sites suggests that humans were capable of cooperative hunting of large game at considerable scale. Some researchers suggest that communities may have developed role-based hunting strategies, with individuals serving as drivers, killers, and processors. The evidence for this level of organization comes from site layout, tool distribution, and bone modification patterns that suggest coordinated activity rather than simple opportunistic hunting. Let me tell you something that might surprise you. Ice Age people were chemists and food scientists. They didn't have beakers or Bunsen burners, but they understood the principles of food preservation that modern food scientists still use today. When a community hunts a mammoth in early summer, when the weather is warm and the insect population is exploding, they face a critical problem. They have perhaps 500 pounds or more of fresh meat. They can eat some immediately. It's delicious, nutritious, energy-rich. But they cannot consume 500 pounds of meat before it spoils. In warm conditions, meat rots. Bacteria multiply. After just a few days, even in relatively cool conditions, meat becomes dangerous to eat. The first method was simple: drying. Hunters would butcher the mammoth, cutting the meat into strips. These strips would be hung on racks or stretched over wooden frames, exposed to the wind and the, in summer, relatively strong sun. Over the course of a week or two, depending on weather, the meat would dry, the moisture content would drop dramatically. Bacteria and other microorganisms need moisture to survive. Without it, they cannot reproduce. The result? Jerky. Meat that could be stored for months. But the summer sun and wind were not always reliable. Some years, the summer was damper. Some years, insects were particularly aggressive. So, there was a second method: smoking. Smoke contains compounds, phenols, for instance, that inhibit bacterial growth. The smoke also creates a surface on the meat that resists insect infestation, and the heat of the fire drives out moisture more quickly than wind alone. Archaeological evidence from a 19,000-year-old site in present-day Jordan shows what may be evidence of this practice. Gazelle bones arranged in patterns suggesting they were processed on smoking racks, with evidence of the fires that would have been used. Imagine an Ice Age settlement in late spring. The hunters have successfully taken several mammoths. Now, for weeks, the settlement is devoted to preservation. Smoke rises constantly from dozens of small fires. The whole community is engaged, some butchering meat, some tending fires, some preparing and checking strips of drying meat. The smell is intense, the smell of smoke and cooking meat. But what's being created is not a meal for today. It's a food bank for the winter. And there's a third method that some researchers believe may have been employed in cold climates, though the direct evidence is more limited: fermentation. Lactic acid bacteria can preserve meat through the production of lactic acid. This acid creates an environment where harmful bacteria cannot survive. Meat placed in a pit in the ground, weighted down, left for weeks, would undergo a process of anaerobic respiration. Bacteria would colonize the meat, producing lactic acid as a byproduct. This acid preserves the muscle mass. The low temperature and low oxygen content of the environment would aid this preservation process. One significant study by researchers found evidence suggesting that in post-glacial conditions, after the Ice Age but in similar cold environments, meat could be preserved for extended periods through burial in small ponds. The meat remained edible for months using this method. Whether Ice Age people employed this technique is suggested by some researchers, but remains somewhat speculative. The oldest confirmed evidence for fish fermentation comes from Mesolithic sites around 9,200 years ago, which is well after the last glacial maximum. However, given the similar climate conditions and the necessity for food preservation in Ice Age contexts, some researchers have suggested it's plausible that such methods may have been used, though direct archaeological confirmation remains limited. It's a technique that may have been employed based on what we understand about the chemistry of preservation and the constraints of Ice Age survival. Picture this: hunters take a mammoth, they butcher it. Some meat goes for immediate eating, some is cut into strips and dried, some is smoked, and some is placed in a pit, covered with stone and earth, left to ferment. As the seasons change, that fermented meat becomes a backup resource. If hunting is poor in the fall, if bad weather prevents drying new meat, those fermented reserves are there. They represent insurance against starvation. But it goes beyond just meat. Archaeological evidence from late Paleolithic sites shows that both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens had complex diets involving several steps of preparation and used plants with bitter and sharp flavors as seasoning. Plants such as wild mustard, wild almonds, which contain bitter compounds requiring processing, terebinth, which contains tannins, and wild fruits are pervasive in the remains from this period. These plant foods might be gathered in summer and then processed for storage, some dried, some fermented, some mixed with fat and meat to create a kind of pemmican-like food product. Evidence suggests that the processing of certain plants, perhaps including the removal of toxins or bitter compounds, was understood and practiced. What all this points to is something remarkable. Ice Age people had mastered the problem of scarcity. They had figured out how to hunt during times of abundance, harvest more than they could immediately consume, and then preserve that harvest in multiple ways. They weren't living hand to mouth. They were farming in reverse, hunting in abundance when prey was available, and then harvesting their carefully stored meat supply throughout the leaner months. This represented a genuine revolution in human survival, because with this technology, preservation, came something almost as important as food itself: stability, predictability. The knowledge that winter was coming was no longer a threat that inspired terror. Winter was a challenge, yes, but it was a challenge that could be managed. You knew that if you hunted well in summer and fall, if you preserved that meat carefully, your family would eat in winter, your children would survive, your community would endure. Let me take you into what we might imagine as an Ice Age home, perhaps a tent-like shelter within a rock overhang, where a fire burns gently in the center, and the family is gathered as evening falls. The temperature outside is dropping rapidly as it does in that climate, but inside, it's warm. A woman sits with 2 children, and she's working on something essential. She's making clothing. In her hands is a hide, the processed skin of a reindeer, treated until it's soft but strong. On her lap is a bone needle she crafted herself, and thread made from flax fibers she gathered and processed. As she works, she's teaching her children. Her hands guide theirs as they practice the basic stitches. To the modern observer, this might look like a simple crafting activity, but it's actually transmission of crucial knowledge. Clothing is survival in this climate. If you don't know how to sew, To mend, to maintain your garments, you will die in winter. The clothing she's making is not simple. It's layered and fitted. The inner layer, which goes against the skin, is made with the fur facing inward, creating a dead air space that traps warmth. This layer might be made from rabbit or hare, animals with fur that provides good insulation without excessive weight. Middle layers add more insulation and wind resistance. The outer layer is made from hide that's been specially treated to repel water. In that climate, where moisture is deadly, this waterproofing is literally a matter of life and death. The garments are fitted. This is important. Loose clothing allows cold air to circulate beneath it, stealing warmth. Fitted clothing, made possible by the needle and thread, creates a barrier that traps warm air close to the body. Archaeological evidence and experimental reconstructions suggest that Ice Age people wore tailored pants, jackets with fitted sleeves, hats, mittens, and boots. These weren't thick, heavy garments like a modern winter parka. They were sophisticated systems of multiple thin layers, each chosen for specific properties, each contributing to a whole that was greater than the sum of its parts. And here's something that strikes me as profoundly human. Not all Ice Age clothing was purely functional. Archaeologists have found evidence of clothing being decorated. Beads made from shells and bone, sometimes dyed, were sewn into garments. Some clothing had patterns, created through the layering of different colored hides. In some cases, the thread itself was dyed. Turquoise, pink, colors that had no survival advantage, but that were beautiful to the people who wore them. This tells us something important about Ice Age consciousness. Even in a world of survival challenge, even in a climate that demanded constant vigilance against the threat of cold and starvation, people cared about beauty. They took the time to dye thread, to create patterns, to decorate their clothing. This wasn't wasteful. This wasn't frivolous. This was an expression of something deeply human. The desire to be beautiful, to be seen as beautiful, to create meaning beyond mere survival. Think about the emotional weight of this. Imagine that you're a young woman approaching adulthood in an Ice Age community. Perhaps your mother and her mother and her mother have all worn clothing made from carefully selected hides, decorated with beads and dyed thread. You learn the techniques from them. You create your own garments, adding your own touches, your own designs. Your clothing becomes an expression of who you are, of your place in the community, of your creativity and skill. Or imagine that you're a hunter preparing for the spring hunt. Your clothing has been carefully maintained through the winter, mended when necessary. As you prepare, you might think about the status and identity that your clothing represents. The quality of your garments reflects your skill as a hunter, because a skilled hunter has the resources to acquire the best hides. Your clothing announces to others in the community that you are capable, that you can be trusted with important tasks. Clothing was practical, yes, but it was also social. It was also spiritual. It was identity made tangible. One of the most important survival technologies that Ice Age people possessed was not a physical tool at all. It was community. It was the ability to work together, to coordinate complex activities, to share resources and knowledge across time and space. A single human being cannot hunt a mammoth. A single human being, alone, cannot survive a winter in the Ice Age landscape. But a community of humans, working together, each bringing different skills, sharing knowledge, can accomplish almost anything. Think about the hunting scenario we discussed earlier. Hunters driving mammoths into a valley to kill animals at a natural choke point. This requires coordination. Someone needs to scout the route. Someone needs to plan where positions will be placed. Someone needs to gather the materials. Multiple people need to be positioned to drive the herd forward, while others wait at the killing site. Someone needs to butcher the animals efficiently. Someone needs to begin the preservation process. Different people need to be assigned to different tasks based on their skills and strengths. This level of organization suggests several things. First, it suggests leadership, someone whose knowledge and judgment people trust enough to follow. Second, it suggests communication, the ability to discuss plans, to adjust strategies, to handle problems that arise. Third, it suggests social structures, ways of deciding who does what, how resources are divided, how disputes are resolved. Evidence from archaeological sites suggests that Ice Age people lived in bands, groups of perhaps 20 to 50 individuals, usually related by blood or marriage or adoption. Multiple bands might gather seasonally, creating larger communities of 100 or more people. Some researchers propose that in particularly rich environments with abundant resources, larger gatherings may have been possible or regular. These gatherings likely served multiple purposes. They were opportunities for the exchange of goods, hides, tools, stone obtained from distant sources. They were opportunities for marriage alliances, for young people from different bands to meet and form partnerships. They were opportunities for ceremony and ritual, for the celebration of important passages in life. And they were opportunities for the transmission of knowledge, for experienced hunters to teach younger ones, for craftspeople to share techniques, for spiritual knowledge to be passed down. Archaeological findings show stone artifacts sourced from sites along vast geographic ranges, sometimes hundreds of miles apart. This means that people were traveling, gathering stone from multiple sources, trading or sharing materials across distances that suggest a kind of early network. They were connected, they were in communication, they knew about other groups, had relationships with them, exchanged goods with them. Imagine being a young trader in an Ice Age community. You've learned from your elders about the roads between settlements. You know which groups have high-quality stone suitable for making tools. You know which groups make particularly good bone harpoons. You know which groups have shell and could provide it in trade. You carry items from your community, perhaps some exceptional flint, or tools your community is known for. And you travel to visit other groups. You exchange goods. You gather information. You perhaps stay for a few weeks. And during that time, you share stories about what's happening in your community, about hunting success or hardship, about new techniques for tool making or food preservation. You return home with goods, with knowledge, with reinforced relationships. This trade wasn't about accumulating wealth. There was no such thing as wealth in the modern sense. It was about maintaining relationships, about ensuring that when your community faced hardship, other communities would help because you had helped them in the past. It was about cultural exchange, techniques and knowledge spreading from group to group. It was about securing access to resources that weren't available locally. Evidence for this kind of trade is substantial. Shells found at inland sites show they came from coastal areas, sometimes hundreds of miles away. Specific types of stone used for tools appear far from their original sources. Artistic styles seem to spread across regions, suggesting cultural contact and influence. Obsidian, a volcanic glass prized for making sharp tools, appears in archaeological sites far from its source, indicating either trade networks or the movement of people across considerable distances. But cooperation wasn't just about trade, it was embedded in daily life, in the fundamental structures of Ice Age society. Think about the family unit. Archaeological evidence suggests that Ice Age people practiced what anthropologists call residential flexibility. After partnership formation, couples didn't necessarily follow rigid patrilocal or matrilocal patterns. Instead, their living arrangements may have been more flexible, based on where resources were available or where they had kinship connections. This seems like a simple practical decision, but it had profound social implications. It meant that men and women had more agency in choosing their partners and where they lived. It meant that knowledge and resources could flow between communities more easily. Within the band, there's evidence suggesting a kind of egalitarianism. Not absolute equality, but a strong cultural emphasis on sharing and on limiting the power of any individual. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies have documented this principle, called demand sharing, the cultural norm that if you have resources and someone in need asks for them, you share. This norm, which still exists in many hunter-gatherer societies today, likely served important functions in Ice Age communities. It ensured that no one starved while others had surplus. It created bonds of obligation and gratitude that strengthened community cohesion. And it prevented any individual from accumulating so much power through resource control that they could dominate the group. But this doesn't mean that Ice Age communities were completely without hierarchy or status differentiation. Some individuals were clearly more respected than others. The best hunters were respected. The most skilled tool makers were respected. The elders who carried knowledge were respected. There's evidence from burials that some people received more elaborate funeral rites than others, suggesting that status existed. But status seems to have been based on achievement and knowledge rather than inherited right. You became a respected leader because you were a good hunter, a good decision maker, someone people wanted to follow. Your children didn't automatically inherit that status. They had to earn it themselves. This is based on patterns we see in modern hunter-gatherer societies and the limited archaeological evidence available, but it paints a picture of societies that were stable, hierarchical enough to coordinate complex activities, but also flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances and prevent tyranny. And then there's the role of women. For much of the 20th century, archaeologists and anthropologists assumed that Ice Age hunting was exclusively a male activity, and that hunting provided the primary food source. Recent research has challenged these assumptions. Multiple lines of evidence suggest that women likely participated in hunting, and that gathering of plant foods, which would have been done primarily by women, provided a significant and possibly dominant portion of the caloric intake for Ice Age communities. Evidence for this comes from multiple sources. Analysis of certain anatomical markers shows stress patterns in both males and females from Ice Age societies, suggesting that both genders were engaged in labor-intensive activities. Analyses of tool marks on bone reveal variation in cutting angles and depths that could be caused by different body mechanics, possibly indicating that different individuals, potentially of different genders, carried out butchering tasks. Some researchers have identified what might be gender-specific tool types, suggesting specialized work roles. Additionally, ethnographic parallels from modern hunter-gatherer societies show that women typically provide 50–80% of calories through gathering, while hunting contributes 20–50%. If Ice Age societies followed similar patterns, and evidence suggests they may have, then the gathered plant foods collected and processed by women would have been absolutely essential to community nutrition and survival. The knowledge required to identify edible plants, know when they ripen, how to process them to remove toxins, how to preserve them, this knowledge was complex and crucial. The implication is that women weren't simply waiting at home for hunters to return. They were active participants in economic life, in food production, in craft production, in the coordination of complex activities. They had specialized knowledge that was essential for survival. Think about this in the context of hunting. If a community goes out to drive mammoths or horses into a valley, do they need strength and size? Or do they need speed, coordination, and stamina? Both men and women can run. Both can carry torches and make noise. Both can help direct animals. Women may well have been crucial participants in these hunts, working alongside men to drive herds, to process kills, to preserve meat. And in gathering plant foods, an activity that required intimate knowledge of the landscape and seasons, of which plants were edible when, how they were processed, women were likely the primary experts. This knowledge had to be accumulated, remembered, and transmitted. The women who held this knowledge were essential to community survival. In a harsh climate where plant foods might only be available for brief seasons, and where certain plants could be toxic if improperly prepared, access to this knowledge meant the difference between survival and starvation. So, the picture of Ice Age society that emerges is not one of male hunters supported by passive female gatherers. Instead, it's a picture of communities where men and women both worked, both contributed essential skills and knowledge, both had roles in hunting, gathering, tool making, and preservation of food. The balance may have been different from modern Western societies, but it wasn't a society where women were powerless or marginal. There's also evidence of mutual aid and support for disabled or injured individuals. Archaeological finds show skeletons of people with severe injuries or disabilities that would have made independent survival very difficult. Yet these individuals survived into adulthood or old age. One famous example is a skeleton from Iraq, dated to around 45,000 years ago, showing a man with a withered arm and blindness who clearly required care to survive. This suggests that communities actively supported their members, that a person with an injury wasn't abandoned or left to die. Instead, the community found ways to keep them alive, to give them roles they could perform despite their limitations. Imagine an Ice Age man who suffered a serious injury to his leg while hunting. In a harsh survival situation, he might seem like a burden, but in an Ice Age community, he survives. How? Perhaps because he has knowledge that's valuable. He's a good tool maker, or he knows medicinal plants, or he's a skilled storyteller who keeps the community's culture and history alive. Perhaps because the community recognizes an obligation to him. He contributed when he was able, and now the community contributes to him. Perhaps because his community loves him, and they keep him alive because they love him. This capacity for compassion, for taking care of the vulnerable, seems to have been deeply wired into Ice Age psychology. It tells us that these were societies with genuine social bonds, where people cared about each other, where survival was about more than just physical strength or economic productivity. In the cold darkness of an Ice Age winter, there are long nights. The sun sets in the early afternoon and doesn't rise until late morning. There are hours and hours of darkness. What do people do during these times? They make art. This is one of the most moving discoveries of Ice Age archaeology. Deep within caves, sometimes so far back that it would have required torch or lamplight to navigate, ancient artists created paintings, engravings, and sculptures. These were not casual doodles. They were sophisticated, intentional, complex works of art. The most famous are the hand stencils, outlines of human hands pressed onto cave walls with pigment. Multiple hand stencils are found at various sites dating to the Ice Age period. At what is now Sulawesi in Indonesia, hand stencils dating back approximately 40,000 years are among the oldest known art. In Europe, hand stencils appear at sites dating from various periods during and after the Ice Age. Imagine standing before a cave wall and seeing dozens or hundreds of human hands stenciled there. Some are tiny, perhaps made by children. Some are larger, made by adults. What are they saying? Perhaps, I was here, I existed, this is my hand. They are an assertion of self, of presence, of mattering. In Europe, famous caves like Chaucer and Lascaux contain paintings of animals, horses, bison, mammoths, rhinoceroses, rendered with remarkable skill and naturalism. The artists clearly knew their subjects intimately. They understood the anatomy of these animals, the play of muscle beneath the hide, the way they moved. Some paintings seemed to capture dynamic moments, animals running, turning, fighting. The pigments used included ochre, iron oxides in various shades, charcoal for black, and possibly manganese dioxide. The technique involved blowing pigment onto the wall around objects to create silhouettes, or applying pigment directly with fingers or simple tools. But the interesting question isn't just, How good were these artists? The real question is why? Why in a climate of survival challenge? Why when so much time and effort had to be devoted to gathering food and maintaining the camp? Would people invest time and energy in creating art? The answer, scholars believe, is that art served crucial psychological and spiritual functions. Art is a form of meaning-making. It's a way of understanding the world, of exerting control over it, of exploring ideas and emotions that might otherwise be inexpressible. Consider the hand stencils. Making a hand stencil isn't technically difficult. Place your hand on the wall, blow pigment around it, remove your hand, you have a stencil. But the repetition of this action, done by hundreds of people over generations, suggests something profound. These are signatures. These are assertions of self. I was here. I lived. I mattered. In a world where individual humans are fragile and short-lived, these handprints are a kind of immortality. Long after the person who made the stencil is dead, that handprint remains. Thousands of years later, we can look at it and say, a human being was here, and they wanted to be remembered. The animal paintings are more enigmatic. There are various theories about their function. One possibility is that they were part of hunting magic, that by painting animals, a community was enacting a kind of sympathetic magic, preparing for hunts, ensuring success. Another possibility is that they served as teaching tools, that experienced hunters brought younger ones into the cave to show them examples of the animals they would hunt, teaching them anatomy and behavior. A third possibility is spiritual in nature, that the caves themselves were sacred spaces, and the paintings held religious significance. But there's another possibility, one that might be as important. These paintings were simply beautiful, and people made them because beauty mattered, because in the midst of survival challenge, humans have always sought to create and appreciate beauty. Because creating something beautiful is a way of saying, my life is not just about survival. I am capable of more. I can create. I can make something that moves people, that brings joy or meaning. Beyond the visual arts, there's evidence of music. Bone flutes have been found at Ice Age sites, and when researchers have recreated them and played them, they produce pleasant musical tones, often capable of producing multiple notes and even simple melodies. Bone and ivory percussion instruments have been discovered at various sites. This means that Ice Age people made music. They gathered to listen to it. They danced, perhaps. They sang. Think about what this means. In a world of constant survival challenge, people took time to create and listen to music. They didn't just eat, sleep, and hunt. They experienced beauty. They experienced joy. Some researchers have suggested that music may have served important social functions, coordinating group activities, reinforcing social bonds, marking important ceremonies and transitions. The spiritual beliefs of Ice Age people are harder to reconstruct with certainty, but some patterns emerge from the archaeological record. The careful burial of dead suggests beliefs about an afterlife or about the continued relationship between the living and the dead. Some burials included grave goods, tools, jewelry, food, as if to provision the deceased for a journey or an existence after death. In some cases, bodies were treated with red ochre, a mineral pigment that might have had spiritual significance, though the exact meaning remains uncertain. There's also suggestive evidence for what anthropologists call shamanism, the belief that certain individuals have special relationships with the spiritual world, that they can communicate with spirits or travel to spiritual realms. Anthropomorphic or theriomorphic, part animal, part human, figures found at Ice Age sites might represent shamans in trance or spiritual beings they encountered. Some researchers have noted that certain individuals at Ice Age sites show evidence of having been disabled or mentally ill, conditions that, in many traditional cultures, are associated with shamanic calling. These individuals might have been shamans, and their disabilities might have been seen as signs of special spiritual power. This remains interpretive, but it suggests ways that even those with physical differences could find valued roles in their communities. Rituals were likely central to Ice Age spiritual life. Gathering in caves for ceremonies, painting animals on walls, playing music, creating and wearing decorative items. All of these could have been part of ritual practice. Rituals serve important functions. They create community cohesion. They reduce anxiety by creating a sense of order and control. They mark important life transitions, births, deaths, initiations into adulthood. They create a framework for understanding the world and humanity's place in it. And this brings us to something important: hope. In a world of genuine danger, where winter could kill you, where hunger was a real threat, where injury or illness might end your life, hope was essential. And hope often is rooted in spiritual belief. If you believe that the animals you hunt have spirits that can be negotiated with, then hunting success becomes partly about spiritual preparation and relationship, not just physical skill. This belief gives you a sense of agency and control. If you believe that the deceased continue to exist in some form and maintain relationships with the living, then death becomes less of an absolute ending and more of a transition. This belief reduces terror around mortality. In Ice Age art and spirituality, we see humans doing what humans have always done, creating meaning in a world that doesn't inherently contain it, creating frameworks for understanding why we're here, what happens to us, what we should value, creating beauty because beauty matters, creating music because music moves the human soul. Let me ask you something. What does it feel like to be afraid for your life? Modern humans, most of us, have experienced fear. Perhaps you've been in a car accident, or had a moment where you thought you might be seriously injured. Perhaps you've experienced illness and wondered if you would survive. That sensation, the racing heart, the dry mouth, the sense of time slowing down, that's what fear feels like. Now imagine that feeling, but chronic. Not occasional, but something you live with much of the year. In winter, when temperatures are dropping and food is uncertain, when you know that people in your community have died in winters past, when you can see the faces of those who didn't make it, this fear is real. It's not paranoia. It's a rational response to genuine danger. Ice Age people would have known this fear intimately. The child who watches an elderly relative grow weaker and weaker as winter progresses, who watches them eventually stop moving, stop responding. That child learns that winter can kill. That's not abstract knowledge, that's visceral understanding. And yet, despite this knowledge, despite this fear, Ice Age communities endured. They didn't fall into despair. They didn't simply give up. They developed strategies, psychological strategies, for managing fear and maintaining hope. One of these strategies was ritual. I mentioned rituals before in the context of spirituality, but let's think about what rituals do psychologically. A ritual is a structured, repeatable action. When you're facing uncertainty, when you don't know if you'll survive the winter, if hunting will be successful, if your children will live, a ritual creates a sense of order. It says, I may not be able to control everything, but I can do this. I can perform this ceremony, speak these words, make these gestures. This is a form of control, even if it's not direct control. It's a way of saying, I'm not helpless, I'm taking action. Think about the hunting ritual. Before a major hunt, a community might gather. There might be a ceremony, a spiritual preparation. Perhaps the hunters paint themselves or wear special ornaments. Perhaps there's a feast before they leave. Perhaps there are songs or chants. To a modern observer, this might seem like it has no practical effect on whether the hunt succeeds, but psychologically, it does something important. It prepares the hunters mentally. It focuses their attention. It strengthens their resolve. It connects them to their community and to the spiritual powers they believe they can call upon. By the time the hunters leave to begin the hunt, they're mentally ready. They believe they can succeed. And belief, as modern psychology confirms, can have real effects. When people believe they can accomplish something, they perform better. They take better risks. They make better decisions. The ritual, by building this belief, actually increases the likelihood of success. Another psychological strategy was storytelling. During the long winter nights when there was little to do but sit around the fire, communities all would tell stories. Some of these stories would have been about hunting, recounting the exploits of great hunters, teaching younger hunters the techniques that worked. Some would have been about the community's history, who their ancestors were, how the community came to live in this place. Some would have been about the spiritual world, stories of shamans, of spirits, of the order of the cosmos. These stories served multiple functions. They transmitted knowledge and culture. They entertained and alleviated boredom during long winter nights. But most importantly, they gave meaning. They said, "Our lives matter. Our ancestors were great. We are part of a story that extends back through time. We are continuing something important." This sense of meaning, of being part of something larger than oneself, is crucial for psychological well-being. It helps people endure hardship. There's also evidence that Ice Age people created art and music that evoke specific emotional responses. The cave paintings of animals could inspire awe or respect. Music could inspire joy, or perhaps meditative calm. Beautiful objects, pendants made from shell or bone, carefully crafted and polished, could inspire pleasure and pride. By intentionally creating these emotional experiences, Ice Age people were engaging in what we might call mental health management. They were actively working to generate positive emotions and experiences that balance the very real stresses of their environment. There's also something that modern psychology calls agency, the sense that your actions matter, that you have the ability to influence what happens to you. Ice Age people, through their technologies, through their hunting strategies, through their food preservation, demonstrated agency. They weren't helpless in the face of winter. They had developed strategies that worked. The success of these strategies, a successful hunt, meat properly dried and stored, a winter survived, reinforced this sense of agency. We can do this. We have done this before, and we will do it again. This is profoundly different from despair, which would develop if people felt helpless, if they believed their actions didn't matter. And yet despair is what you would expect in a climate this harsh, if people lacked the technologies and strategies we've discussed. But Ice Age people had those technologies. And perhaps equally importantly, they had social support. They lived in communities where they weren't alone. When you're suffering, when you're afraid, the presence of others makes a real difference. Ice Age people didn't face winter alone. They faced it with their families, their bands, their extended networks. And this made it bearable. There's something else too. The possibility of happiness, of joy, of moments of genuine pleasure. A successful hunt isn't just about food security. It's also a victory. It's a moment where the hunters can come back to the community and be celebrated. There's pride, accomplishment, the respect of others. Or imagine a birth. A new child joins the community. There's joy, hope for the future, celebration. Or imagine a gathering where multiple bands come together. There's music, dancing, the pleasure of connection and social bonding, the exchange of goods and information. These moments of joy aren't trivial. They're essential parts of a life worth living. And perhaps this is the most important thing to understand about Ice Age survival. It wasn't just about physical survival. It was about psychological and emotional survival. It was about maintaining the capacity to find meaning, beauty, connection, and joy, even in a world of genuine hardship. It was about believing that the future mattered, that tomorrow was worth preparing for, that your life and the lives of your loved ones had significance and value. I want to tell you about something that might seem surprising. Ice Age people were traders and travelers. They were connected through networks that span considerable distances. How do we know this? Because we find objects far from their sources. Shells from coastal areas turn up at inland sites. Specific types of high-quality stone used for tools appear in locations hundreds of miles from where that stone naturally occurs. Artistic styles and techniques seem to spread across geographic regions, suggesting cultural contact and influence. This means that Ice Age people were traveling, they were exploring, they were meeting other groups, exchanging goods, sharing knowledge. Imagine being a young man or woman in an Ice Age community. You've learned from your elders about the routes to neighboring groups. You know which groups have access to high-quality stone. You know which groups make particularly good bone harpoons or other tools. You know which groups have shell and could provide it in trade. You decide to make a journey. You prepare, gathering goods your community has made or can offer. You have companions, perhaps several young people who want to travel together. You set out. The journey is not easy. The landscape is harsh. But you know the route. There are landmarks you've learned about. Certain rock formations, certain river crossings, certain caves that serve as known resting places. Perhaps there are established trails that multiple groups use, trails worn into the landscape through repeated use over generations. You travel for days or weeks. You're subsisting on what you can hunt or gather, on preserved meat you've brought with you. Eventually, you reach the territory of another group. You approach cautiously. These people aren't enemies, but they're not family either. But you have trade goods, and they have goods they're willing to exchange. The trade is negotiated. Value is established. Goods are exchanged. And perhaps, since trade isn't just economic but also social, you're invited to stay for a time. You eat with this group. You learn their ways. You perhaps meet someone from this group and feel attraction. Possibilities for future alliances begin to form. Then you return home, carrying new goods, new knowledge, new stories to tell. This kind of trade and exchange of people wasn't unique to the Ice Age. It's been a feature of human societies for tens of thousands of years. But in the Ice Age, when communication was difficult and travel was challenging, the existence of these trade networks suggests a remarkable level of sophistication in Ice Age social organization and planning. And trade wasn't just about exchanging goods. It was about spreading ideas. If one group develops a new hunting technique or a new tool design, that innovation can spread through trade networks to other groups. If one group develops a particularly effective way of preserving meat or processing hides, that knowledge can spread. Cultural and technological innovations don't stay isolated. They propagate through these networks. We see evidence of this in the archaeological record. Certain tool styles seem to appear over wide geographic areas and last for long periods of time. This suggests that successful tool designs were adopted by many groups. Certain artistic styles and decorative motifs appear across regions, suggesting that art styles were adopted and adapted as people encountered them in trade or through cultural contact. There's also evidence of exchange networks that specifically transported specific materials across large distances. Obsidian, a volcanic glass, is extremely sharp and excellent for making fine tools, but it only occurs in areas with volcanic activity. At sites far from volcanic areas, archaeologists have found obsidian that can be traced through geological analysis to specific volcanic sources. This means people were traveling to volcanic areas to get obsidian, or they were acquiring it through trade networks that stretched from volcanic areas to distant communities. What this tells us is that Ice Age people understood the principle of comparative advantage. They recognized that different places had different resources, and that exchanging these resources benefited everyone. A coastal community could exchange shells for stone from an inland community. An inland community with access to excellent flint could exchange stone tools for preserved fish or shells. Everyone benefited. Everyone had access to a wider range of goods and resources than they would have if they were isolated. This trade likely also facilitated the exchange of marriage partners and kinship alliances. When your community traded with another community over generations, relationships formed. Young people might meet during trading visits and decide to partner with each other and possibly form families. This created kinship ties that bound communities together. If one community faced hardship, a failed hunt, a disease outbreak, a harsh winter, they could call upon their relatives in other communities for support. These networks also likely facilitated the movement of people. If a young person in one community was restless, or if their birth community was overcrowded, or if there was conflict, they could move to another community where they had kinship connections. This movement of people helped spread new ideas and techniques. It created genetic diversity, important for the health of small populations, and it allowed people to find communities where they fit better, where they could contribute better, where they could find happiness and meaning. There's also evidence that Ice Age networks extended across very large distances. Some of the materials found in European sites can be traced to sources in regions far to the east. This doesn't necessarily mean that a single tool traveled thousands of miles through direct trade. Instead, it suggests a chain of trades. Group A trades with Group B, which trades with Group C, which trades with Group D, which has access to the distant resource. But the end result is that materials reach distant locations. These are continental scale or even larger networks. In northern latitudes during winter, the night is not simply long, it is profound. There are places where, in deep winter, the sun barely rises above the horizon. It emerges weak and pale, climbs a quarter of the way across the sky, and sets again. The day might last 3 to 4 hours. The night lasts 20 hours. Imagine living through this. Modern humans experience something called seasonal affective disorder during the winter months when daylight is limited. People become depressed, lethargic, struggle to find motivation. This is a real physiological response to reduced light. Ice Age people living in northern latitudes would have experienced this effect, but magnified considerably. They weren't just experiencing shortened days, they were experiencing near total darkness for months. And yet, they lived there. They chose to stay in those northern lands, at least seasonally. Why? The answer is that the northern lands, despite their harsh winters, offered something valuable. They offered abundance in summer and fall. During the brief summer, the plants grew rapidly, explosively, blooming and producing seeds and berries in incredible profusion. Migratory animals, reindeer, horses, bison, moved north in summer to graze on this suddenly abundant vegetation. Salmon ran in rivers, birds nested and laid eggs. Insects emerged in clouds. The northern landscape in summer was a garden of abundance. So, Ice Age people made a trade-off. They endured the brutal darkness and cold of winter, because summer offered wealth and opportunity that couldn't be matched in more temperate regions. In those brief months of summer, they could gather enormous quantities of food, create huge preserves, build their resources. Then, as winter approached, they either migrated south to warmer regions, or they settled into their winter camps and lived off the carefully preserved bounty. But this raises a psychological question. How did they maintain mental health during those dark winter months? The answer likely involves several things. First, they had shelter and fire, which provided not just physical warmth, but also psychological comfort. A shelter with a fire burning is a refuge. It's a place of safety, of gathering, of community. The warmth and light are sources of comfort. Extended family and friends are present. This goes a long way toward preventing despair. Second, they had work and purpose. Winter was not a time of idleness. Even though hunting might be difficult, there were many tasks to accomplish. Tools needed to be crafted and maintained. Hides needed to be processed and sewn into clothing. Meat needed to be monitored and managed. Bone and antler needed to be worked into useful items. Artistic projects could be pursued. These activities kept people engaged and provided a sense of purpose and accomplishment. Third, they had ritual and ceremony. Ceremonies marking the winter solstice, the turning of the year, the promise of spring's return. These rituals would have been psychologically important, marking progress through the dark season, affirming that winter would eventually end, that spring would return, that the cycle would continue. Fourth, they had storytelling and art. Music, art, stories. These would have been sources of joy, meaning, and connection during the long, dark nights. Imagine a community gathered around a fire on a winter night. Outside, the wind howls and the temperature plummets. But inside the shelter, there's warmth and light. Someone is telling a story, their voice carrying in the flickering firelight. Others are working on crafts, their hands busy but their minds engaged. Someone is playing a flute, creating beautiful music. In these moments, despite the harsh world outside, there's beauty, connection, meaning. I want to focus on the psychological resilience that Ice Age people must have possessed. Resilience is the ability to face adversity and not be broken by it. It's not the absence of difficulty or fear. It's the capacity to face difficulty and fear and continue forward anyway. Modern psychology research suggests that certain factors contribute to resilience. Social connection is one of the most important. People who have strong relationships, who feel part of a community, who have social support, are more resilient. Ice Age people had these things. They lived in close-knit communities. They had family and kinship networks. They had ritual and ceremony that reinforced community bonds. Sense of meaning and purpose is another factor. People who believe their lives have meaning, that they're contributing to something larger than themselves, are more resilient. Ice Age people seem to have had this. They had roles in their communities. They had spiritual beliefs that gave their lives meaning. They had stories and art that expressed this meaning. Competence and efficacy is another factor. People who believe they have the ability to solve problems, to handle challenges, are more resilient. Ice Age people had developed technologies and strategies that worked. When faced with the challenge of surviving winter, they had solutions. These solutions worked, which reinforced their belief that they could handle challenges. Hope is crucial. People who believe that the future will be better, or that they can handle whatever comes, are more resilient. Ice Age people had reason for hope. The seasons turned in a regular cycle. Spring would return, summer would return. The animals would migrate again. The plants would bloom again. This cyclical view of time, grounded in natural patterns they could observe and predict, gave reason for hope. This winter will be hard, but it will end. Spring will come. We will survive, as we have survived before. And perhaps there's something else. Acceptance. Ice Age people seem to have accepted the challenges of their environment rather than despairing at them. They didn't pine for a more temperate climate. They didn't resent the darkness and cold. Instead, they adapted. They developed technologies and strategies. They made meaning. They found beauty and joy within the constraints of their world. This kind of psychological resilience, the ability to face hardship and find meaning within it rather than being broken by it, is something we might learn from. Life in Ice Age communities was, by modern standards, precarious. Infants and children faced significant mortality rates. Women faced substantial risks during pregnancy and childbirth. Infections, injuries, and illnesses could be fatal. Estimates based on skeletal evidence suggest that significant numbers of children died before reaching adulthood, and that life expectancy at birth was considerably lower than today. This is important context for understanding Ice Age psychology around birth and death. And yet, archaeological evidence shows that children were valued, cared for, and mourned when they died. We know this because children are found in burial sites, sometimes buried with grave goods, tools, ornaments, food. These are not the burials of unwanted infants. These are the burials of children who were loved, children whose loss was significant to their communities. Imagine an Ice Age mother giving birth. The process would have been similar to childbirth in all eras. Painful, dangerous, potentially life-threatening. But she would have had community support. Other women who had given birth before would be present, offering knowledge and comfort. Her female relatives would help her through it. Once the baby was born, there would be care and nourishment. The baby would be wrapped and kept warm. The mother would be supported and cared for as she recovered. Childbirth would have been a significant community event. The successful birth of a healthy baby is genuinely important. It's the continuation of the community, the future of the group. There would likely be celebration, ceremony, the recognition that something important has happened. Infancy would have presented challenges. The baby needed to be kept warm and fed. Nursing would have been the primary form of feeding. Breast milk was, of course, available. And there's no clear archaeological evidence of alternative feeding methods for Ice Age infants. The child would be carried, likely in some kind of sling or wrapping, that allowed the mother or caregiver to have hands free while keeping the child close and warm. As the child grew and became more independent, they would begin to learn the skills they would need as an adult. Archaeological evidence shows that children participated in making art. Some of the handprints found on cave walls are very small, clearly made by children's hands. Were these children brought deep into caves and led through rituals? Were they initiated into some kind of spiritual understanding? We don't know for certain, but the presence of their handprints suggests that they were included in important community activities, that they had roles to play even at a young age. And when a child died, and many did, to disease, accident, or illness, that death was significant. The child was buried, sometimes with grave goods. Ochre was sometimes applied to the body. This suggests belief in some kind of afterlife, some kind of continuing existence for the child. It suggests that the parent's grief was recognized and honored by the community. As children grew into adolescence, they would have been initiated into more complex knowledge. Learning to hunt would be a gradual process, beginning with smaller animals and gradually moving to larger prey. Learning to craft tools would require years of practice under the guidance of skilled tool makers. Learning the spiritual and cultural knowledge of the community would involve instruction from elders and shamans. By the time a young person reached adulthood, perhaps around 15 or 16 years old, they would be fully integrated into the economic and social life of the community. Adulthood brought new responsibilities and new rituals. Partnership and marriage alliances, for instance, would have been significant events. They weren't simply personal choices. They involved families, created alliances, potentially united different bands. There would have been ceremony and celebration. Young adults would establish themselves as hunters, tool makers, parents. They would take on roles in the community's economic and spiritual life. And then came old age. Elders held crucial roles. They were repositories of knowledge. They remembered past hunts, past winters, past droughts. They remembered stories, spiritual knowledge, techniques, and technologies. They served as counselors and decision makers. They were respected. There's archaeological evidence that elders were cared for even when they could no longer contribute directly to hunting or food gathering. This suggests genuine respect for age and the wisdom that came with it, and finally, death. When someone died, there was burial. The body was often treated with care and ceremony. It was sometimes colored with ochre. Whether this had spiritual significance, was related to preservation, or served some other purpose remains debated among researchers. The body was sometimes buried in a flexed position, as if still curled in the womb, suggesting belief in some kind of rebirth or continuation. Grave goods were sometimes included: tools, ornaments, food. The gravesite itself was sometimes marked, suggesting that the location was remembered, possibly visited by the living. What do these burial practices tell us? They tell us that Ice Age people had beliefs about what happens after death. They believed possibly in an afterlife. They believed that the dead maintained some kind of relationship with the living. They believed that death was not an ending, but a transition. And they believed that how the dead were treated mattered, that respect and care should be shown to the deceased. This is profoundly human. The belief in some kind of afterlife, the ritual treatment of the dead, the desire to remember and honor the deceased. These are things that humans have done across cultures and throughout history. They reflect a basic human need to find meaning in death, to believe that the people we love are not simply gone, that something of them continues. The circle of life, birth, growth, adulthood, old age, death, was recognized and honored. Each stage had its significance. Each stage had its rituals and ceremonies. And the circle continued, generation after generation. Children were born and became adults. Adults became elders. Elders died and were mourned and remembered. And the community continued forward. Sound, subtle shift. The ice and snow sounds gradually fade. The sound of water running, of ice melting, spring returning, the sound of birds, life awakening. Around 21,000 to 20,000 years ago, the last glacial maximum began to wane. Temperatures started very gradually to rise. Not dramatically, the shift was slow, taking place over thousands of years. But it was significant. The great ice sheets began to retreat, the climate warmed, the landscape that Ice Age people had adapted to so successfully began to transform. This presents an interesting question. How did Ice Age people respond to climate change? Because this was climate change, slow, long-term, but profound. The answer seems to be that they adapted again. They were skilled adapters after all. As the climate warmed, the megafauna, the mammoths, the woolly rhinoceroses, the giant cave bears began to decline. Some went extinct. Others migrated to new, colder regions. The species composition of the landscape shifted. Plants that could tolerate extreme cold were replaced by plants adapted to milder conditions. Forests began to expand into what had been open steppe. Ice Age people responded by developing new, hunting techniques for the animals that remained. They responded by expanding their diet to include more plant foods and smaller game. They responded by developing new tools suited to these new prey. In Europe, the period after the last glacial maximum, called the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age by archaeologists, saw the development of microliths and other small tools suited to hunting smaller game in more forested environments. This wasn't a catastrophic collapse. It was adaptive change. In some regions, as the climate continued to warm and plant foods became more abundant, people began to shift toward more sedentary lifestyles and, eventually, the domestication of plants. This is the origin of agriculture, which eventually led to the civilizations and societies we know today. But this didn't happen everywhere at once. In regions with abundant wild resources, coastal areas with fish, forest areas with nuts and game, people continued hunting and gathering for thousands of years, adapting to the changing climate, refining their technologies, maintaining their culture. What's remarkable is that the technologies and strategies Ice Age people developed didn't disappear. They were refined and adapted, certainly, but the fundamental principles remained. The use of fire, the creation of shelter, the preservation of food, the development of specialized tools. These practices, born during the last glacial maximum when they were essential for survival, continued to serve humanity well in the warmer climates that followed. And the psychological and social structures that Ice Age people developed, the importance of community, the transmission of knowledge across generations, the creation of meaning through art and spirituality, the resilience in the face of hardship. These two continued. They became part of the human heritage. They shaped how humans would face challenges and build societies going forward. As we draw toward the end of our journey tonight, I want to step back and reflect. We've traveled 20,000 years back in time, lived through the coldest period of the Ice Age, walked with our ancestors through the longest and harshest nights. We've seen how they survived, how they thrived, how they created meaning even in the face of enormous challenge. What can we learn from this? What does the Ice Age story have to teach us today when we face challenges of a very different nature? The first lesson is about resilience. Ice Age people faced genuine existential challenges: cold that could kill in hours, hunger that could become desperate, predators and accidents and illness. And yet, they didn't despair. They didn't simply give up. They developed solutions. They adapted. They found ways not just to survive, but to create beauty and meaning. This kind of resilience, the ability to face hardship and continue forward, is something we might aspire to in our own lives. The second lesson is about community. Ice Age people understood that, alone, an individual human is fragile. But in community, with others, human strength multiplies. A problem that's overwhelming to one person becomes manageable when faced by a group. Work that's impossible for one person becomes possible when many hands contribute. And perhaps more importantly, challenges are more bearable when faced with others, when you're supported by a community that cares about you. In our modern world, we often overemphasize individual achievement and autonomy. Ice Age people remind us that community matters, that we need each other, that our well-being is bound up with the well-being of those around us. The third lesson is about innovation and problem solving. Ice Age people didn't have modern technology, but they were creative and clever. When faced with a problem, how to survive extreme cold, how to hunt massive animals, how to preserve food for long periods, they innovated. They looked at the resources available to them and figured out how to use them in new ways. They built on the knowledge of their predecessors and passed on their knowledge to successors. This culture of innovation and problem solving is something that served them well, and it's something we need in our modern world as we face challenges like climate change and resource scarcity. The fourth lesson is about balance. Ice Age people balanced survival needs with the need for beauty, meaning, and joy. They made art even when they lived in a harsh world. They made music. They created ceremonies and rituals. They told stories. They cared about aesthetics, the beauty of their clothing, the beauty of objects they created. We sometimes act as if survival and meaning are in opposition. That if we're struggling to survive, we can also pursue beauty and meaning. Ice Age people show us that this is false. Beauty and meaning are not luxuries. They're essentials. They're part of what makes life worth living. The fifth lesson is about knowledge transmission. Ice Age people understood that knowledge is precious, that skills needed to be taught, that younger generations needed to learn from their elders. They invested time in teaching. They created rituals and ceremonies that transmitted knowledge. They told stories that encoded important information. In our modern world, with all our technology, we sometimes devalue this kind of direct knowledge transmission. But Ice Age people knew something important. Knowledge doesn't exist just in books or data. It exists in relationships, in apprenticeship, in the guidance of experienced people who care about you. This kind of knowledge transmission creates bonds between people and ensures that crucial understanding passes from generation to generation. The sixth lesson is about adaptation. The Ice Age climate was changing, gradually but persistently. Ice Age people didn't resist this change or despair at it. They adapted. They developed new technologies suited to new conditions. They shifted their diet and hunting practices. They changed their settlement patterns. This flexibility, this willingness to adapt rather than cling to old ways, is crucial for human survival. It's relevant for us today as we face climate change and environmental transformation. The seventh lesson is about finding meaning in hardship. Ice Age people faced genuine suffering, cold, hunger, injury, loss. And yet they created systems of meaning that allowed them to endure this suffering without being destroyed by it. spiritual beliefs that explain the world and humanity's place in it, rituals that created order and predictability, art that expressed deep emotions and connected them to something larger than themselves. In our modern world, we often try to avoid suffering to minimize pain. But Ice Age people show us that suffering, while never good in itself, can be bearable when it's placed within a meaningful framework. When you understand why you're suffering, when you believe that the suffering has purpose or will lead somewhere, it becomes more bearable. The 8th lesson is about hope and the future. Despite the harshness of their world, Ice Age people believed in the future. They prepared for it. They told stories about it. They had children and raised them, believing that those children would survive and create their own lives. They invested in long-term projects, art in caves, elaborate burials, multi-generational hunting sites. This orientation toward the future, this belief that tomorrow matters, is essential for maintaining hope and continuing to work toward goals. It's relevant for us when we face challenges that can feel overwhelming and seem to suggest a bleak future. The 9th lesson is about the power of ritual and ceremony. Ice Age people used ritual to create order, to mark important transitions, to reinforce community bonds, to generate hope and meaning. We've sometimes in the modern world dismissed ritual as superstition or unnecessarily complicated, but Ice Age people understood something important. Ritual works. It changes how we feel. It creates community. It marks time and creates structure. It connects us to something larger than ourselves. The 10th, and perhaps most important lesson is this: humans are remarkable. We are capable of facing impossible challenges and not just surviving, but creating beauty and meaning in the midst of hardship. We are capable of love and compassion. We are capable of innovation and problem solving. We are capable of finding joy and creating art even when life is difficult. Ice Age people, living in a world we can barely imagine, manage all of this. They showed what humans are capable of. We've journeyed back 20,000 years tonight. We've walked through the longest, coldest nights that our ancestors faced. We've seen how they survived, how they thrived, how they created meaning in a world that offered genuine hardship and danger. Now, as our time together draws to a close, I want you to imagine something. Imagine that you are an Ice Age person, standing at the end of a long winter. It's early spring. The temperature has begun, ever so slightly, to warm. The sun is climbing a little higher in the sky each day. The darkness that lasted through the long winter months is beginning to recede. Somewhere in the distance, you can hear water running, the sound of ice melting, of the landscape coming alive again. You think back on the winter. It was hard. There were cold nights when you wondered if you would survive. There was hunger when game was scarce. There was loss when someone in your community died. There was fear and uncertainty. But you did survive. Your community survived. And now, as spring approaches, you feel something that might be called hope. The cycle is continuing. The seasons are turning. The long night is ending. The sun will return stronger. The animals will migrate. The plants will bloom. And you and your people will be here to see it, to participate in it, to continue your journey forward. This feeling, this sense that even the longest night must eventually end, that darkness gives way to light, that hardship is not permanent, but part of a larger cycle. This is perhaps the deepest lesson that Ice Age survival teaches us. In our modern lives, we face challenges. Some are external: climate change, economic uncertainty, social conflict. Some are internal: depression, anxiety, the sense that life is overwhelming. These challenges can feel like a kind of endless night, a darkness that seems like it might never end. But the Ice Age reminds us, endless night never comes. The cycle always turns. The long night always ends. And humans have the capacity, the resilience, the creativity to not just survive the night, but to find beauty and meaning within it. The handprints on the cave walls, made 20,000 years ago by hands long since turned to dust, still speak to us across the millennia. They say, "I was here, I lived, I mattered, my hand was here, and it still matters 20,000 years later." They say, "You, reading this, you matter too. Your life matters, your struggle matters, your survival matters." And the art, the music, the rituals, the carefully crafted tools, the preserved meat, the communities gathering together in the face of hardship, all of it says the same thing. Life is worth living. Life is worth fighting for. Life is worth creating beauty within. Life is worth honoring and celebrating, even when it's hard. As you drift towards sleep tonight, I want you to carry this with you. You are the heir to an enormous legacy of resilience, creativity, and love. Humans have survived the longest, coldest nights. Humans have faced genuine hardship and responded not with despair, but with innovation and beauty. Humans have built communities, created meaning, loved each other, and continued forward across hundreds of thousands of years and countless challenges. You are capable of the same things. Not because life is easy, it never has been, but because humans have always found ways to endure hardship, to find meaning, to create beauty, to love, to hope. The Ice Age is over, the climate has warmed, the mammoths are gone, the landscape is transformed, but the human capacity for resilience, for community, for innovation, for meaning-making, that has endured. That continues in you, in all of us, every single day. Tonight, as the long day ends and night falls, remember, the night, no matter how long, always ends. The sun always rises, and humans will be here, meeting the light with the same resilience and creativity that our ancestors brought to the Ice Age darkness. Thank you for joining me on this journey back through time, into the longest and coldest nights that human beings have endured. Thank you for walking alongside our ancestors, for witnessing their lives, their struggles, their triumphs. If this story has touched you, if it has moved you or inspired you or given you a sense of connection to the great sweep of human history, I have one small request. If you genuinely enjoyed this journey, if you feel like these stories are valuable, stories of resilience, of human strength, of the meaning we create in the face of hardship, then please, like this video, let other people know that these stories exist, that they matter. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to Whispers of Time. There are so many more stories waiting to be told. Stories of ancient cities and lost civilizations. Stories of people who faced incredible challenges and persevered. Stories of human creativity and love, and the enduring power of community. Each night, we can travel to a different moment in history, and each story has something to teach us. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I love knowing that across the world, in different time zones and different places, people are joining me on these journeys through time. Your presence, your attention, your care in listening to these stories, that matters. It connects us across space and time, just as the trade networks of the Ice Age connected communities across vast distances. Sleep well tonight, knowing that you carry within you the resilience of your ancestors. The humans who survived the Ice Age were not different from you. They were the same species, with the same capacity for struggle and survival and meaning-making that you possess. May your night be restful. May the dark bring you peace. And may you wake refreshed, ready to face whatever challenges your day brings, knowing that humans have endured far worse and continued forward.